Hi everyone and hello to this video. So last time we left off with our well projection camera. So we sorted that out, and now if you go to our geometry builder, you're going to see this create cube geometry method. It's too big, so that's why I didn't want to code it in this video. So you can just copy paste it from the GitHub. It's in geometry builder, and then we're going to use that method to see the following, and then I'm going to discuss what we're going to do in this video. So let's just here in our main, we were calling create quad geometry, but now I can just call create cube geometry, and it's going to create cube. So before I start, I just want to make one small adjustment. I'm just going to bring it a bit closer so that it's easier to see, maybe even closer. Let's go with 1.5. Okay, cool. And then else, I'm just doing these changes so that it's easier to see stuff on the side. Okay, this is perfect. So what we're going to do this video is, as you can see, as this cube rotates, there is some fighting between the textures, right? You can see it here. So we're going to try to solve that. And how do we solve that? Well, we solve it with depth testing. So to explain depth testing and how we perform it, well, it's actually really. So if you do not perform depth testing, this kind of things will happen because it kind of draws with this painting algorithm. I forgot what this is called, but basically just the last thing that's drawn is actually going to overwrite whatever it is in a buffer, well, our drawing buffer. So what we need to do is create a depth buffer, and depth buffer is usually just a texture, right? But you can also think of it as a chunk of memory. And what that memory is going to do is whenever our new z, so I'm just going to call it z kernet, is less than a value that's already in buffer, let's call this z previous, right? Whenever it's less, this thing is going to get into buffer, right? But if our z kernet is greater than what's already in buffer, z previous, then nothing happens. So that's how our text is going to look like. Of course, you can modify that test, but usually you just want to test if our new z value is just less than a previous z value, and then you write it to the buffer. And buffer is just a texture, and you're going to see it at the end. So basically, to actually create a buffer, we're going to create a texture. So that's kind of interesting. So let's get on with it. So let's just see where I'm going to create it. So somewhere over here is probably a good place as any. So I'm just going to say depth texture, and I should probably modify code a bit to know where the things are, but anyway, let's just create it. So we're going to say device create, and I can probably move this out and maybe zoom in a bit. Let's zoom in a bit so just it's visible. I always forget what's the, okay, all right. So let's create the texture. Create texture. All right. So what do we need? We need size, and we can leave it at a width of a canvas width and height of a canvas height. So usually format. So whenever you create a depth texture, also you're going to often hear stencil texture. And stencil texture is kind of for masking or some algorithms, but we're not going to be using stencil texture. So you can use a format like this, and it's quite common. But since I'm not using stencil texture, I can just use all 32 bits in a pixel, or 4 bytes, right? You have 4 bytes in a pixel for red, green, blue, and alpha usually, but those are just numbers, so you can use them however you want. So I'm just going to use 32 for depth, and it needs to be render attachments because it's going to be rendered into. And basically I think that's almost it. So we just need to paste it. We need to configure depth, and we're going to configure it whenever we create a render path encoder. So I'm just going to say here configure depth. So we have our texture, and then we have something called depth stencil attachment. So we don't care about stencil buffer for now, but we do care about depth. So we're just going to use depth texture, create a view into a texture. So you have this depth load operation, and depth store operation. So when we load our texture, we want to clear it, right? And whenever we store, we just want to store the values. So that's kind of how it works. It's a bit unusual, but it is what it is. And here it's wrong suggestion. Probably API changed since GitHub has taken a look into it. But depth clear value. So how are we going to clear the buffer? So I already mentioned that we have a buffer, but buffer is usually going to be going to go from 0 to 1, with the value set 1 being the furthest away. And we already discussed that last time, right? When we were doing projection, how we were always writing 0 to 1, so we can also set up buffer like that. So we're always going to clear it to 1 at the beginning, so it's going to be full white texture. And then as we write values to it, it's going to, those values are going to be a bit like, they're going to be darker, or fully black if something is at 0. So okay, we have configured the depth, and one last step. So if I save now, it's going to crash, and we just need to go to our unlit render pipeline, and here somewhere where we're setting up the pipeline, we also need to set depth stencil attachment, and it's here probably when we create our render pipeline. So where is it configured? So let's see. I had that. I forgot actually. So we need to configure depth stencil. Configure depth, right? Depth stencil, same. So what do we care about here? Depth write enable true. We want to write depth buffer. Depth compare. So that compare function that I mentioned, we're going to use less. So if our new value is less than what was previous in the buffer, we write to it. If it's equal or if it's greater, then the previous value we don't do nothing, we just discard it. And here this format needs to be the same as format of texture, right? So usually you want to pass this in, but I'm kind of lazy, and this is for learning purposes, so I'm just going to keep it like this. But so just so that you're aware, you usually need to pass this in because it needs to be same on the depth texture and here. So as you remember, on the depth texture we configure it when we created a texture. All right, if I save, generally it should work, but I'm not in a correct file. I'll save it here, and it works. Okay, cool. So with that, we can just make one small modification. We can create a second texture that's going to kind of overlap this texture, so just to test it a bit further. And for that we can go to main. Actually, I just want to show you this texture first. So if I go to our WebGPU, so this is basically debugging tool. Not sure if I mentioned this previously, but you can find it. You just Google WebGPU Chrome debugger or something like that, and it should be you should be able to see it. But here we have texture, and this is our depth texture, right? As you can see, so we have some values, and then this is all depth information. As you can see, render attachment format is depth to float. We could also give it a name, probably it has label, and so we can call it just depth texture, and here the label is going to be filled with that if I manage to do it. So it's probably good for debugging, so I just need to reset it. Debugger is kinda, sometimes it just doesn't work, so let's try it again. Let's inspect it. GPU. Will I get those textures? Here. Here we can see depth texture, right? This label. So that's our depth texture. Okay, we figured that one out. So let's just do one more test in our main. Let's see where I'm going to do it. We had our unlit pipeline, so I'm just going to be lazy, and we're going to deal with this second time. So I'm just going to create unlit pipeline 2, This is going to be same, so I'm just shamelessly going to copy paste this and just say 2 to here. So we have our unlit pipeline 2, and then I can do also this. Okay, maybe. So they're overlapping, so I'm just going to move this a bit so that we have 2 rotating cubes. And they are kind of overlapping, but our depth testing is working. Okay, so that's basically it for this video. This was a quick one, but so just that you're aware. So you perform this depth testing by creating basically a depth buffer, which is usually just a texture, right? So we created a depth texture. We needed to configure our render path with it. So we configure that, and then just in our unlit pipeline we also had to configure depth stencil values. So that's it. That's how you do depth testing. For the next video, I think we're going to do instance rendering so that we can avoid duplicating our pipelines like I did here. So we're going to deal with that because we can pass some information that's going. If you have same materials, you can actually kind of save on performance and you don't have to create that many pipelines, but that's for the next time. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and until next time.